The smell of frying oil clung to his clothes, no matter how many times he washed them. Every morning, Ravi would step into the tiny roadside restaurant, tie the faded apron around his waist, and brace himself for another day of endless orders, clanging plates and impatient voices. The owners called him boy, the customers called him waiter, but no one ever called him by his name. His dream of doing something big felt like a fragile spark in a storm, always at risk of being extinguished. Ravi's father had been a small farmer in their village, but a season of heavy floods destroyed their crops, leaving the family with nothing. His mother sold jewelry to pay off part of the debt, and his father moved to the city in search of work. When Ravi turned 17, he too had no choice but to find a job. The little restaurant took him in, not because they needed staff, but because he agreed to work long hours for very little pay. His day started before sunrise. He would mop the greasy floor, wipe down the wooden tables that were rough from years of use, and arrange dented steel plates for breakfast service. When customers began arriving, the real chaos started. Orders shouted from the kitchen, teacups clattering, steam clouding his glasses as he rushed to serve. Sometimes wealthy customers would complain about the smallest things, as if the entire world's dissatisfaction could be poured onto the shoulders of a teenage boy earning barely enough to survive. But Ravi never answered back. Instead, every time someone humiliated him, he would quietly promise himself, "One day, I will have my own place, and no one will talk to my staff like this." That silent vow became the one thing that kept him going. He didn't have money for big dreams, but he had time, the one currency no one could take from him. After work, when the restaurant closed at midnight, he would sneak into the internet cafe next door. The owner, an old man with kind eyes, let him sit at a corner computer for free when business was slow. Ravi would watch videos about hospitality, hotel management, and stories of entrepreneurs who started from nothing. He couldn't afford a business course, but the internet became his university. Still, life was unforgiving. Some nights, he'd walk back to his rented room and find eviction notices stuck on the door because he was behind on rent. On others, he'd go to bed hungry so he could send a little more money home to his mother. The loneliness pressed on him, but he refused to let it break him. Then, one rainy evening, everything changed. A businessman came to the restaurant, drenched from the storm. The other waiters avoided him because his wet clothes dripped onto the floor, but Ravi brought him a clean towel, served him hot tea, and even offered to dry his coat near the kitchen stove. The man, surprised by such kindness, struck up a conversation. His name was Mr. Kapoor, and he owned a small chain of goose houses. They talked for over an hour. Mr. Kapoor was impressed by Ravi's knowledge of hotel management, which seemed far beyond that of an ordinary waiter. Before leaving, he handed Ravi a card and said, "If you ever want to work in a hotel, call me. I like people who serve from the heart." Ravi didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he called Mr. Kapoor and was offered a front desk assistant job at one of his goose houses. The pay was slightly better, but the real opportunity was the exposure. For the first time, Ravi was in a real hospitality environment, learning everything from bookings to guest relations to managing staff. Over the years, he worked his way up from front desk assistant to manager and then regional supervisor. But he never forgot his original dream, owning his own hotel. Every bonus, every raise he saved. He didn't buy expensive clothes, didn't waste weekends partying. Every rupee was a brick in the invisible foundation of his future. 10 years later, Ravi saw an old, run-down hotel listed for sale. The building was tired, the walls peeling, the lobby dark and lifeless. But Ravi saw something no one else did. Potential. He poured all his savings into buying it. Friends called him crazy. But he worked day and night, supervising renovations, hiring the right staff, and creating a culture of respect and warmth. When the hotel finally reopened, it was nothing like its former self. The lobby glowed with warm lighting. Rooms were spotless, and the aroma of freshly baked bread filled the air. Guests left with smiles, and reviews poured in praising the personal touch and kindness of staff. One afternoon, a man walked in and stood at the reception desk, staring at the lobby with a strange expression. It was Mr. Kapoor. "So," he said with a smile, "you finally did it." Ravi shook his hand firmly. Yes, sir. And it all started with that cup of tea you drank in a tiny restaurant. Today, Ravi's hotel is one of the most sought after in the city. He still keeps his old waiter's apron framed in his office, a reminder of the boy who once served others' dreams while secretly building his own. Because Ravi learned one powerful truth. You can spend your life serving tables, or you can build a table where others dream to sit. Ravi's life began in a small, dusty town where dreams were often crushed under the weight of survival. His father worked as a mechanic in a roadside garage, and his mother stitched clothes for neighbors. They'd barely earn enough to keep the family afloat. And by the time Ravi turned 17, the reality of life had already hit him like a storm. College wasn't an option. Money wasn't there. The only job he could find was as a waiter in a rundown highway hotel. The first day, he stood in the corner, wearing an oversized uniform that smelled faintly of detergent, watching customers laugh, eat, and leave without thinking about the boys silently filling their glasses. It wasn't glamorous. The hours were long, the tips were small, and sometimes the humiliation was worse than the work itself. People would snap their fingers at him, yell if an order was late, and often treat him as invisible. But Ravi had one thing most people didn't see. He was watching, learning, absorbing everything. He didn't just serve tables. He studied how customers ordered, how the chef prepared meals, how suppliers bargained, how bills were handled. At night, after work, he'd sit in the empty dining hall, flipping through old magazines and watching YouTube videos about business, cooking, and hotel management on his cracked phone. He was planting seeds, though at the time, no one noticed. One evening, a wealthy businessman came in. Ravi served him with his usual quiet dedication. Impressed by his politeness and efficiency, the man asked, "Do you like working here?" Ravi smiled faintly and replied, "It's not where I want to be, but it's where I'm learning to be where I want to be." The man nodded, perhaps sensing something in the boy's eyes. Over the next few years, Ravi did something incredible. He didn't just work for a paycheck. He worked for knowledge. He learned how to manage inventory, how to negotiate with vendors, how to deal with unhappy customers, and even how to keep the kitchen running smoothly on a tight budget. He started saving every single tip he got, cutting all unnecessary expenses. By the time he turned 24, Ravi had saved enough to lease a tiny roadside cafe. It was nothing fancy, just 6 tables, a small kitchen, and a borrowed coffee machine. The first few months were brutal. Some days, no customers came in. Some nights, he slept in the cafe because he couldn't afford rent elsewhere. But he never stopped smiling, never stopped trying. Slowly, word spread about the polite young man serving delicious food with genuine warmth. Truck drivers stopped by regularly. Families from nearby towns made weekend trips to eat there. A travel blogger happened to post about his cafe, and suddenly he had people coming in from the city. Within 5 years, that tiny cafe had grown into Ravi's Grand Inn, a 3-story hotel with a restaurant, a rooftop dining area, and rooms that were booked months in advance. The very suppliers he once saw negotiating with his old boss now sat in his office, asking for his business. And in the lobby of his hotel, framed on the wall, is an old photograph, Ravi in his oversized waiter's uniform, holding a tray with a nervous smile. Beneath it is a plaque that reads, "Don't just work to earn, work to learn. One day, you'll own the place you once served in." Today, when young employees ask him for advice, Ravi tells them, "Your job title doesn't define your future. Your work ethic, your learning, and your persistence do." Because once, he was just a boy cleaning tables for strangers. And now, he welcomes guests into his own hotel.